Welcome back, everybody. I hope nobody's sick. Everybody's ready to go. We're going to talk about Jews in the Roman Empire today and their interaction with Roman religion and what the Romans thought about them. So let's just jump into it and begin with the diaspora. Now, what does diaspora mean? It means a dispersion, a scattering about. The Jews, as you know, lived in Palestine, but very early in their history began to be scattered. Um, and so we just want to look at how the Jews got scattered around the Mediterranean because that's where the Romans then encounter them. So the dispersion of the Jews began in 586. That's when the Babylonians swept in, and Nebuchadnezzar, whom you probably encountered in the Old Testament, it took the inhabitants of Jerusalem into captivity. So in 538 BC, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, and it was Cyrus of Persia who allowed the Jews to return to Palestine. But a lot of them didn't stay. They liked Babylonia. That was the only home that some of them knew, so they stayed there. And in Babylonia, in Babylon, there were flourishing communities existing for centuries. Um, There they produced in late antiquity the great monument of rabbinic learning, the Babylonian Talmud. It was written in Eastern Aramaic, and it includes rabbinic discussions on law, ethics, history, and so forth. And you may have wondered why it was that the people, kings we call them, but the wise men come from the east seeking the birth of Jesus. Well, they're undoubtedly leftovers of Jews from Babylon who, you know, were scholars of the Old Testament. During the Hellenistic period, that is the period of Alexander the Great and after, when Greek was spread throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, many Jews migrated from Palestine, also from Babylonia, and they settled around the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in Syria, Asia Minor, that's modern day Turkey, and Egypt. These are the places where, at least Syria and Asia Minor, is where Paul had many of his missionary journeys, and that's why, because there are a lot of Jews settled in that area. Jewish military colonists had lived at Elephantine, way down the Nile, the first cataract, modern day Aswan. They'd lived there for a long time. During the Persian conquest of Egypt, they had settled there, and now they were joined by new military and civilian settlers in both countryside and town. The community at Alexandria, Alexandria, you know, was founded by Alexander the Great, became the most important city in the diaspora. The splendor of the synagogue was a byword. Its mixed Jewish Greek culture was highly creative. It was probably to this city that Jesus and his family fled uh, during the slaughter of the infants by Herod. Remember, they left and they went to Egypt. I think there's an Anne Rice novel about it. But anyway, Jesus and his family probably went to Alexandria because there was already a huge Jewish community there. The number the numbers alone made the Jews prominent inhabitants of the city. But by the first century AD, There were sizable communities in most of the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Acts of the Apostles, is about Paul traveling around prominent synagogues all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Expansion to Italy and the West began later, but the community in Rome was established by about 150 BC. Jews taken as slaves after the various wars in Palestine swelled the numbers of the diaspora, as in due course did the voluntary attachment of pagans to the Jewish synagogues of Rome. So a lot of pagans were converting and becoming Jews in Rome. So the numbers grew. So inscriptions from the Jewish catacombs of Rome reveal the existence of 11 synagogues in the 2nd to 4th centuries AD. And some of their names suggest that they were founded during the Augustan period during the 1st century BC. Diaspora Jews retain their identity in the basic religious practices of Judaism. What are those? Male circumcision, the observance of the Sabbath, other festivals like the Feast of the Tabernacles, which was kind of a Thanksgiving harvest festival, the avoidance of non-kosher meats. And until 70 AD, when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, their allegiance to the temple and to Jerusalem as their mother city was signaled by the payment of a temple tax and the practice of pilgrimage at the major agricultural festivals. At the same time, inscriptions concerning Jewish benefactions and commemorations from many cities in the Eastern Roman Empire make it clear that the Jews adapted to their varied environments. So they're integrated into the city, they're giving money to the city, they're setting up monuments. Greek was their native language. In Cyrenaica, which is Libya today, at Berenike there were Jewish town councilors. There were young people becoming citizens, Ephebes we call them, Ephebes. And that occurred as early as the 1st century AD. In other words, they're becoming citizens, they're involved in the government there in North Africa. In the 3rd century AD, it was very common for the Jews to be citizens, counselors. Non-Jews expressed their attachment to the Jewish synagogue by becoming benefactors. They were known as God-fearers or sympathizers and proselytes. That is, they converted to Judaism. There's a great Jewish inscription from the city of Aphrodisia in Asia Minor, and it shows an association of Jews and proselytes underwriting a memorial there together with a separate group called God-fearers. So there's these categories, you see. And some of those God-fearers were town councilors. So the Jews were well integrated into these cities throughout the Mediterranean. Now, these Jewish communities gained a lot of rights, partly by the diplomacy, the advocacy of certain leading figures. One being Hyrcanus. He was a Jewish high priest. You see his name there on the slide. He reigned as high priest from 67 to 40 BC. He was from the Maccabean family, and the Herodians, Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, using their diplomacy, all of these guys gained for the Jewish communities in the Roman provinces the patronage successively of Caesar, Mark Antony, and then Augustus. So in their disputes with neighbors, you see they were assisted by Roman decrees, which upheld their right to observe their customary practices. These decrees were adopted empire-wide as precedents. So you have synagogues, for example, and they were classified as colleges, collegia. And Caesar comes along at some point and bans collegia, these uh, small groups that band together under a certain banner or cause, interest, but they were banned by Caesar, but the synagogues were exempted. So you see, the Jews are getting special privileges that other people aren't in the Roman Empire. They had the right to raise, deposit, and transmit the temple tax. So that's unusual. Think about if we had a subgroup in America raising their own taxes outside of the government and sending them overseas. So that would be an unusual situation, but the Jews had gained the right to do that. They were permitted their special food markets. Um, they were exempted from appearing in court on the Sabbath. Sometimes they were exempted from military service in the Roman Empire, which would render the Sabbath observance impossible. So Christian authors later described Judaism as a religio licita, that is a legitimated religion in the Roman Empire on the basis of these um, arrangements. Furthermore, after the destruction of the temple, the the half shekel or 2 drachma tax paid by all adult Jewish males to the temple in Jerusalem. Remember, it was destroyed in 70 AD. This was extended to women and children after the destruction of the temple, and the Romans, punishing the Jews, diverted those funds to Jupiter Capitolinus, and deposited this new money in the Fiscus Judaicus, the Jewish fund. So after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, they're being punished. The money is still collected even more than before and being diverted to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. You can imagine how much money that was coming in to support the temple of Capitoline Jupiter. It must have had a lot of money. Let's see, this is a bronze Sestertius. It says on there, Fisci Judaici Calumnia Sublata. Uh, some sort of abuse involved here, possibly to Romans, friendly to Jews. Um, they went around and they checked for circumcision, you see, and So some Romans were being abused. They checked to see if they were circumcised, and so this abuse was uh, removed on this coin. Um, so Domitian, the Roman Emperor Domitian, uh, made notoriously harsh exactions of this penalty um, on the Jews, but Nerva issued coins announcing the removal of the abuses, and that's what this coin is right here. The palm tree being a symbol for uh, Judea. Mhm. So this would have been somewhere around 96 to 98 AD, after the Flavian emperors Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, and then you get Nerva coming in, and he's more favorable to the Jews, and he removes this abusive um, tax. But even with the taxation, there's implicit in it an official acknowledgement of the existence of Jewish communities, and this also contributed to the Christian sense that the Jews had been legalized. Now, we're going to talk about in a few minutes about the Jewish revolt that took place in the 60s against Rome that led to the destruction of the temple and the city pretty much there in 70 AD under Vespasian and Titus. But first, let's just mention an incident recorded by Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Jewish um, captive. He was captured in the Jewish revolt in 66 AD. He was brought to Rome, but he was highly educated, and he wrote in Greek a history of the Jews and of their struggles with the Romans. It was called Antiquities of the Jews. And in this work, he talks about um, an incident dating from somewhere around 46 to 44 uh, BC. This passage of Josephus um, demonstrates that in the first century BC, before the revolt, 100 years before the revolt, that the Jews had these special privileges throughout the empire. So here's a piece of evidence showing us how that would work. It involves a couple islands and islands out in the Mediterranean, especially the island of Delos and the region of Parium. And we have this quote uh, by Josephus about an incident there in 46 BC. It goes like this. You can read it on the screen. Julius Gaius, this is some governor of Asia or something like that, consul of the Romans, to the magistrates and council and people of Parium, greetings. The Jews in Delos, which is under the jurisdiction of Parium, you see, and some of the neighboring Jews, in the presence of some of your ambassadors, have appealed to me, declaring that by decree you are preventing them from following their ancestral customs and sacred rites. Now, it is not pleasing to me that such decrees should be passed against our friends and allies, and that they should be prevented from living in accordance with their customs and from contributing money to common meals and sacred rites, when they are not prevented from doing this even in Rome. For example, Gaius Caesar, our consul, by edict prohibited religious associations from meeting in the city, the collegia that we were talking about. But these people alone, that is the Jews, were not prohibited from collecting contributions of money and holding common meals. Likewise, I also ban other religious associations, but allow these people alone to assemble and hold meals in accordance with their ancestral customs and conventions. It's really interesting to see that small religious associations were not allowed in Rome. It was only public religion, and people had to really sneak around to have any sort of um, private associations, private gatherings of meetings outside their homes. Of course, the families could have private religion in their home, but not groups of people. I also ban other religious associations, but allow these people alone to assemble and hold meals in accordance with their ancestral customs and conventions. And if you have passed any decree against our friends and allies, you would be well advised to annul it because of their assistance and goodwill toward us. Two Jewish leaders had been helpful to Julius Caesar when he besieged Alexandria in 48, 47 BC. Okay, so that's interesting that the Jews, because these customs are ancestral, they're long-standing, and that seems to have allowed them a standing there in the Roman Empire that you don't find among other peoples. Now, periodic expulsions of the Jews weren't unheard of from the city of Rome, but they were normally short-lived and didn't undermine their standing elsewhere. We have three expulsions of the Jews recorded, one of them being suspect, but let's look and see what they are. One was in 139 BC. The first Jews who had settled at Rome were pretty quickly expelled after about 20 years or so by virtue of a law which proscribed, prohibited the propagation of the cult of Jupiter Sabbatius. Sabbatios, if you use the Greek spelling, some sort of Phrygian horseman sky god equated by the Greeks with Zeus. Now, according to Valerius Maximus, this cult was suppressed at Rome in 139 BC. And when it was suppressed, the Jews were kicked out along with um, the adherents of this cult of Jupiter Sabbatios. And it's conjectured that the Romans had identified the Jewish Yahweh Sabaoth, Lord Sabaoth. I think there's some Christian hymn that uses that Sabaoth. It's from the Old Testament, and it's actually a possessive form or genitive form, not possessive, but an objective genitive, we would call it in Latin. Anyway, it's an of word, so it's Yahweh, Lord of the host, Sabaoth. The quote from Valerius Maximus is this: Gnaeus Cornelius Hispalis, praetor peregrinus, in the year of the consulate of Marcus Popilius Linus Lucius Calpurnius, ordered the astrologers by an edict to leave Rome and Italy within 10 days, since by a fallacious interpretation of the stars they perturbed fickle and silly minds, thereby making profit out of their lives. The same praetor compelled the Jews who attempted to infect the Roman custom with the cult of Jupiter Sabbatius to return to their homes. That comes from Valerius Maximus. So there's this absurd connection you see of Sabbatios and Lord Sabaoth. and it gets repeated throughout Roman history. And the date of that corresponds to the 139 BC. And in a similar vein, Plutarch, Greek writer, um, maybe 100 years later or more, 200 years later, he maintained that the Jews worshiped Dionysus and that the day of the Sabbath was a festival of Sabbatios. So no modern reader would confuse Yahweh with Dionysus or Sabbatios, but the Romans did. They had an imperfect understanding of the Jews who lived among them. The Jews were also expelled in 19 AD by Tiberius. 4,000 Jewish men were conscripted into the army and sent to Sardinia, a little island, while many others were banished from the city along with supporters of the cult of Isis. That's probably the last time the worshippers of Isis were kicked out of the city, because shortly thereafter it was, you know, a temple was built and so forth. We have a lot of evidence about this event. Uh, Josephus, whom we mentioned a little while ago, presents this expulsion as punishment of an entire people based on the actions of few. This is pre-Jesus, you see, 19 AD. While the Roman historian Dio presents it as a Roman reaction to a larger phenomenon of Jewish proselytism. In other words, a lot of Romans were converting to Judaism. Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, all these historians connect the expulsion um, with simultaneous measures against the cult of Isis and a general mistrust among the Romans of foreign cults, especially those which were spreading among the ranks of the political elite. So Jews without full citizen rights, the peregrini as they're called, they're simply expelled. While the citizens were drafted into the army to fight bandits in Sardinia. A dangerous mission. It's like being put on the front lines. The climate in Sardinia was unhealthy, that sort of thing. In any case, it was not successful in terms of the permanent removal of the community, because Jews are in Rome again in numbers large enough to trouble the writer Seneca with their customs by the mid first century. So it didn't last very long. They're also expelled in 41 AD under the reign of Claudius. He orders the Jews to stop holding meetings, including prayer services. We have a lot of incomplete and contradictory evidence about this event. The book of Acts in the Bible records the arrival of Priscilla and Aquila at Corinth from Rome because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave. Now, this would have been sometime in the late 40s by the chronology of that book, or 48 or 49 AD. Suetonius tells us that the Jews were expelled from Rome at an undated time under Claudius because they were rioting at the instigation of Chrestus, not Christ, but Crest. And there's a great deal of debate whether this refers to disruptions caused among the Roman Jews by the first Christian preaching in their midst, or This is an unrelated event. The historian Dio says that there were too many Jews for Claudius to expel easily, and so he merely ordered them not to meet in the first year of his reign in 41 AD, and then finally expelled them in the ninth year of his reign in 49 AD, and that would fit the Priscilla Aquila arriving in the late 40s into Corinth, and that's where Paul met them there. So look in the book of Acts if you're interested. Priscilla and Aquila, Paul has a good relationship with them at Corinth. They had been at Rome and were expelled. So it seems like there were two events, you see, a prevention of Jewish meetings early and then an expulsion later in the 40s. So whatever happened, there was a troubled relationship between the Roman Jews and Claudius. The authorities, fear of disturbance and non-Roman practices, the Romans hated that, rather than overt proselytizing, was the immediate cause of anti-Jewish measures, as of those against other alien cults and practices like ISIS. They just hated small groups of people engaging in their own religion that was not sanctioned and controlled by the state. We don't really get evidence of the Jews seeking converts, proselytizing during this period. The first indication we get of the Jews doing any converting was under the reign of Septimius Severus in 200 AD, when he actually passed a ruling saying that the Jews had to stop converting people to Judaism. But it's not like they sent out missionaries or anything like that. It's just people were being attracted to the religion of the Jews. In 63 BC, a civil war between the Jewish claimants for political power led to the intervention of Pompey, who had been invoked as arbiter. He laid siege to Jerusalem, violated the temple, he even entered the Holy of Holies, a great sacrilege to the Jews there in their temple, and he finally reduced Judea to the form of a Roman province. That was in 63 BC. In 39 BC, Herod the Great, having won favor of the leadership at Rome, was installed as king of Judea, and he kept himself in power by uh, servile flattery of Marcus Antonius. He's the guy uh, who had built this, rebuilt, re renovated, I would say, the second temple. Remember, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Jews came back 538, rebuilt the temple, and now Herod the Great made it even better. Now, at the death of Herod, Augustus Caesar divided up his territory among his sons, but then a state of anarchy ensued, and the country was re-annexed to the Roman dominions, no longer um, ruled independently by a king. So going back to Herod for a second, this is the one that's known as Herod the Great. Um, he was born in 74 BC. He died in 4 BC. Client king, if you want to call him that. The Romans are still in charge, but they had let him rule it as king. So he's not the same Herod that was alive when John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth were active. That was a different Herod. That was Herod Antipas, also the same dynasty, but he was ruler after Herod the Great from 4 BC to 39 AD, but still under Roman control. So this Herod the Great, you see, is known for these colossal building projects in Jerusalem, and rebuilt that second temple in Jerusalem, which is sometimes referred to as Herod's temple. Um, so Josephus talks about him a lot. Um, Sometimes he's described, though, as a madman, murdered members of his own family, murdered some of the great rabbis. And he's the one, that Matthew records in the Gospels as having massacred the innocents when he heard that Jesus was born or some sort of ruler over the Jews was born. He had all the children um, killed. So the Jews were suffering greatly from the oppression of the governors that were put over them during this period. So you could have a king and he had some power, but you also had a Roman governor over them and these governors came and they just were abusive and they were trying to extract money from the region so that they could get rich. They didn't care about their religion. They were stealing property. These governors were exacting money and so forth. So it is under Nero that a great revolt took place at Rome, at Judea, against all this Roman rule that was over them. And there was a governor at the time. His name was Florus, Gessius Florus, not Florius, Florus. Um, and the revolt took place and Jerusalem fell into the hands of the insurgents. So Gessius Florus was there at Jerusalem from about 64 to 66 AD. He was a friend of the family of Nero. A lot of greed and injustice to um, the Jewish population there, and his unsavory governorship of Judea is what really caused the great Jewish revolt. Just to give you an example, one of the things or a couple of the things that Gessius Florus did to cause the great Jewish revolt. So he set up his office there in Caesarea, and he favored the local Greek population over the Jewish population. And one of the notable things that happened is that while the Jews were worshiping at their local synagogue, um, some Greeks came in and sacrificed some birds on top of, and anyway, at the entrance of the synagogue, and that made the building ritually unclean. And so the Jews sent a group of men to petition Florus for redress to this outrage, and he demanded that they pay him 8 talents, which was a whole lot of money, to hear the case. And then Florus took the money and refused to listen to the complaints and instead put the petitioners into prison. And then he made the Jewish population even angrier by removing 17 talents from the treasury at the Temple of Jerusalem, claiming the money was for the emperor. And so, in response to this, the city fell into unrest, and some of the Jewish population began to openly mock Florus. They passed around a basket saying they were collecting money because he was so poor, he needed money and whatever. And so Florus reacted to the unrest by sending soldiers into Jerusalem the next day, raided the city, arrested a number of the city leaders. He whipped them, he crucified them, despite the fact that some of them were Roman citizens. And so we get the Great Jewish Revolt after that. In the revolt, the Roman governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, was routed by the Jewish army. So the Jews had uh, some successes at the beginning. So this, it begins around 66 AD, and it ends with uh, the legions of Titus besieging and destroying Jerusalem, defeating the remaining Jewish strongholds. So the revolt, you see, was crushed by Vespasian, besieged Jerusalem in 68 AD. There was a lot of suffering, a lot of ferocity of defense, and Josephus immortalizes this. And then it was Titus who finished off the siege because Vespasian had to go back to uh, Rome. Nero had died, and Vespasian was trying to become emperor, which he did, and he left his son there to finish off the siege and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And he this is why we have that arch of Titus. Part of his triumph when he came back to Rome, he had a triumph, um, destroying the city. Titus brought back with him to Rome a mistress from among the Jews. Berenike was her name. Um, she had been the sister of King Agrippa, and so she was a Jewish princess. Titus liked her a lot, and so he promised to marry her. And this was, you see, the Jewish royal family coming close to having imperial power, but the Romans disapproved, and so eventually she had to be sent away. So now the city is oppressed, but eventually they get their feet back under them, and in 130 AD there's another revolt, and under the reign of Emperor Hadrian, and he destroys the city completely, razes it to the ground, and renames it Aelia Capitolina, and no Jew is allowed to enter the city again. So that's the Jewish experience with the Romans. It went very well at first, and they got special privileges. The Romans saw this as a very ancient religion, and so it had special privileges. But eventually the Romans didn't like the Jews didn't like the way they were being abused. They didn't like the sacrileges that were taking place in their temple, and so they revolted, and they were squashed by the Romans. And after that, uh, it didn't go well for the Jews. Uh, for the most part, there were some bright spots there at Rome, and they were still accepted from somewhat, but in general, it didn't go well for the Jews after that. So I will end with this. It's a nice coin. As I recall, this is a coin has something to do with the destruction of Jerusalem there at the end, and its renaming is Aelia Capitolina. Sorry, I don't have better information on that coin for you. Anyway, so I'll leave you with that, and I will send along a quiz. Be sure to take it and get it back to me on Wednesday morning. Stay safe. Be well.